Do you feel like Finnegans Wake is one of those works you just don't get? You don't see the hype around it. You don't even really see what Joyce is trying to do? Well, in fact, much of his audience felt the same way, as he was serially publishing the work as work in progress. He started it about 1924, and Finnegans Wake was published as Finnegans Wake in 1939. So it took him a really, really long time to write Finnegans Wake, and throughout that, he was constantly concerned with the interplay between the developing, burgeoning, germinating text and the audience, which was the counterpart to that text, which was to be the very receptive milieu through which the work would progress. And he saw a lot of distasteful comments that were being made about these fragments as they were being published in, among other places, transition. And he decided that he needed some kind of place to house some more positive literary criticism about what was going on in his text, what he was trying to do. So he got together a number of friends and acquaintances who wanted to write something, and they published Our Exagmination Round His Factification for Incamination of Work in Progress. James Joyce Finnegans Wake, a Symposium. A very, very long, convoluted title, and funnily enough, one that actually gets later quoted, although elusively and obliquely, in Finnegans Wake. On page 497, his producers, are they not his consumers? Your examination round his factification for incamination of a warping process. So, of course, he takes work in progress and turns it into warping process, which indeed is one of the ways that a text gets echoed in this interplay between author and audience, one of the chief concerns of Finnegans Wake. But in this lecture, I would like to look at 5 essays among the many that I could talk about that are featured in this symposium, which I find really helpful for providing some very cogently positive words about Finnegans Wake and also expressing some of the theoretical background and intentions of what's going on in the text. I'm going to be covering Dante, Bruno, Vico, Joyce by Samuel Beckett, James Joyce's Work in Progress and Old Norse Poetry by Frank Budgeon, Prolegomena for Work in Progress by Stuart Gilbert, Mr. Joyce Directs an Irish Word Ballet by Robert McAlmon, and Joyce and His Dynamic by John Rodker. These essays provide some nice kind of structural architecture for someone who maybe wants to get into Finnegans Wake. They don't want to go directly into the text. They need something, and maybe you don't just want to go based off of a 5-minute YouTube video. Well, first off, this will be longer than 5 minutes, but also this is hopefully something to convince you to actually pick up this work. It's kind of hard to find. You might be able to find a PDF online, but it's really, really worth it because it's very short, but it's one of the best introductions and overviews and explications of the theory behind Finnegans Wake. In Dante, Bruno, Vico, Joyce, Samuel Beckett tries to trace in particular the relationship between Joyce's writing and that of Giambattista Vico, an Italian philosopher of history who has a conception of history which is cyclical. There are a number of general laws that govern historical development, progression, and decline and death for Vico, and these correspond to certain ages. These are namely the theocratic, the heroic, the human, and the chaotic, or the recurso. In the theocratic age, thunder claps from God, and this scares us into our first fear of God. This is the birth of religion and the birth of society in general, because we start congregating in caves, and the family is born and things like this, so we get basic social situations as a response to fear. Then in the second heroic cycle, we get the development of maturity through marriage, through stronger social bonds, through a notion of posterity and looking to the future. Third, we have the human age, commonly called the democratic or the civil age, where we have towns, cities, and even states proper. This corresponds to corruption and the beginning of a decline. We are reaching an apex point, after which things come falling down and we are buried, and we achieve the fourth short recurso stage, which is signaled by a thundercrack, which is basically the voice of God tumbling down the Tower of Babel that is society, that is its would-be success, and we see a corresponding destruction into chaos, which is then the precondition for the generation that will start back over these cycles again. And all of these are very important for Joyce because, in a way that you see in Nietzsche, for example, every act of creation is simultaneously an act of destruction. Bred within each of these moments is the necessity for the other in a sort of dialectic way. Therefore, we have an interplay in Vico's philosophy as well as in Finnegans Wake between content and form. The content is regressively and progressively informed by its formal relation to other elements, which are subject to general structural rules. And the form is itself altered by the content, because each of these cycles is different in its content. It's not as if it's just literally repeating the exact same things over and over. No. We know that history doesn't repeat itself exactly, but as the Mark Twain quote goes, it often rhymes. As such, Beckett says, here form is content and content is form. You complain that this stuff is not written in English, but it's not written at all. It's not to be read, or rather, it is not only to be read. It's to be looked at and listened to. His writing is not about something. It is that something. And this is a very kind of postmodern technique where we see embodied in the text the sort of confusion, anxiety, aleatoriness that defines modern life, and we're not just focusing on trying to evoke these as formal elements of a character's thought process, but rather this spills forth into the linguistic practices of Finnegans Wake. Therefore, he says that the importance in work in progress is treating words as something more than mere polite symbols. Language is treated not as just an empty structure to be filled, but a dynamic milieu and medium through which readers change and recursively and reciprocally interact with the text. This writing, he says, that you find so obscure is a quintessential extraction of language and painting and gesture with all the inevitable clarity of the old articulation. The old inarticulation being this moment of primal stupidity and madness where institutions have not yet been developed and we're just scrounging for things. And there's an immediacy to, the sight of something fearful. It instantly strikes fear into you because you don't have the protective mechanisms necessary to respond in any other way. And this articulateness of the inarticulate is something that Joyce really tries to put on the page in the same way that he tries to say the unsayable. He puts into language that which is extra-linguistic. Things like anxieties and fears and fantasies which are not linguistic, or feelings or pain or sounds. And of course, the difference between sound and language becomes so blurred that it might as well be non-existent in Finnegans Wake. Here, Beckett says, is the savage economy of hieroglyphs. Here, words are not the polite contortions of 20th century printer's ink. They're alive. They elbow their way onto the page and glow and blaze and fade and disappear. And you'll never read a work that is more responsive to your reading than Finnegans Wake. You'll never read a work in which the words so thoroughly demand to jump off the page and into your mouth and to be recursively spoken back into it, breathing in the breath of life. This inner elemental vitality, which is a perfect way of talking about Finnegans Wake, and corruption of expression imparts a furious restlessness to the form, which is admirably suited to the purgatorial aspect of the work. And Finnegans Wake takes formal play to a whole new level. In Ulysses, this play really changed chapter by chapter. But in Finnegans Wake, it's changing sentence by sentence, word by word, letter by letter. It's fantastically complex, mind-bogglingly complex. It's as complex as the universe itself, in my opinion. There's an endless verbal germination, maturation, and putrefaction. The cyclic dynamism of the indeterminate. This reduction of various expressive media to their primitive economic directness, and the fusion of these primal essences into an assimilated medium for the exteriorization of thought is pure Vico, and Vico applied to the problem of style. But Vico is reflected more explicitly than by a distillation of disparate poetic ingredients into a synthetical syrup. We notice that there is little or no attempt at subjectivism or abstraction, no attempt at metaphysical generalization. We are presented with a statement of the particular. That's the really magical thing about Finnegans Wake, is there is structural progression going on in Finnegans Wake. There is momentum and there is a sense of perspective. There is a sense of each word being located in part of a whole and a component part, a machinic part of that whole. It is a machinic assemblage proper in the Deleuze-Guattarian sense. But because of that, each element presents itself as an immanent particular, not an ideal universal, but a reified affect which is there for the reader to sort of eat. So I think that Beckett is really good at this. This is just a brief kind of part of his essay, is really good at getting us to understand the relationship between that universality and particularity that we see kind of teamed out in Vico, but really taken to that Nietzschean Deleuzian extreme in Finnegans Wake. In James Joyce's work in progress in Old Norse poetry, Frank Budgeon connects a lot of the allusions in Finnegans Wake, and indeed the style and the environmental proclivities of Finnegans Wake, to that of the Eddas of Old Norse mythology. He says that like every great craftsman, he freely makes use of all that he finds existing and adds thereunto his own inventions. And one of the things that a lot of the critics in this collection express is that we have taken for granted the vitality of language, and we have therefore led to a stultification of language. A dying husk has been formed in the place of what was originally a creative way to learn to communicate, to learn to order, as Deleuze and Guattari would put it, to do all sorts of things. But we've grown so accustomed to it and so used to it as something that we learn to approach in its exactitude that we forget to create a lot. And we see this brought back in culture today, and now we have an intense creation of neologisms in the form of random words that come off of TikTok or Instagram or random sites on the internet. This is the sort of creativity that Joyce wants to bring into language, and it creates a properly polylingual global sense of language's capacities. For Joyce's purpose, Budgeon writes, no word is unpoetic, none obsolete. Words fallen out of use are a racial experience alive but unremembered. That's a really interesting ethical dimension of the Wake that I haven't seen touched on a lot, but I'm interested to read some more post-colonial stuff about Finnegans Wake, is that he's trying to revive a lot of cultures that are lost on the Western eyes and ears, and mouths and noses and feeling organs. That we've just forgotten the places that our language came from, the deeply rooted relationship that English has as this sort of melting pot of signifiers and signs. Therefore, when in the poet's imagination the past experience is relived, the dormant word awakes to new life, and the poet's listeners are lifted out of their social, functional grooves and partake of the integral life of the race. This is very interesting because Joyce often tries to make us look at the text from above. He will invoke the reader's perspective. He will invoke a sense of depth of this is just a dream. This is the HCE is just an ideal. These kinds of things which would seem to minimize and distance us from the text. But then he sort of chaotically and abruptly brings us back into the text, shows us that we can't, in fact, distort and take away the text from our interaction with it. But in fact, we're constantly in a conversation with it, such that we partake in the life of our past. We literally have a resurrection of previous elements brought to life through this livid language. He writes, in Finnegans Wake, or work in progress at this time, we see an intensive technique, a greater density of word texture. Indeed, this is the hyper-packed nature of the textual economy of Finnegans Wake, which I've talked about before. Meanings can no longer lie side by side. Here they overlap, and there into one word he crowds a whole family of them. A letter added or left out, the sound of a vowel or consonant modified, and a host of associations is admitted within the gates. And one letter may stand pregnant with meaning as a rune. And indeed, Joyce's obsession with runes and hieroglyphs and pictograms are evident all throughout Finnegans Wake. He's extremely keen on seeing language as evocative and imagistic, which is to say, they evoke their own autonomous experience, which affects us immediately and brings us into conversation with a hyper-packed signifier, which is not just individual blots on a page. It's much more than that. It stands for a history. It stands for that which has been forgotten, that which we ought to remember. It has value judgments and beliefs impregnated inside it. Through this singular compactness, a page of Joyce's composition acquires some of the potency of a picture. The words seem to glitter with significance as they lie on the printed page. We speak them and they flow like a river over our consciousness, evoking images vivid and unexpected as those of a dream. And in Work in Progress, the poet's imagination seems one with racial memory. Human society, in its groups, tribes, nations, races, searches the earth and its legends for the story of its beginning. And this creates a lot of problems viewing Finnegans Wake because, for example, Shem the penman, the sort of alter ego of Joyce, is often portrayed as a black man of some kind and is the object of racism in a similar way, but way more extreme than we see to Leopold Bloom and Ulysses, who as a Jew in Ireland is without a nation in a sense. He feels out of place. He's respectable and yet nevertheless shunned by his society. He is a raceless man in a sense. He has been properly otherified from the notion of race and indeed blackness as such. Many, cultural theorists have discussed this, that blackness indeed is, in a sense, an absence of a race. It is a sort of vacuous hole for the other that doesn't fit the pretensions of the white man, of rationality, of common sense, of decency, of civility, all the other stereotypes that go along with what it means to be white. So indeed, we do see a very problematic, very fantastical, very filled sense of what racial conflict looks like in Finnegans Wake. He says that this is not as an ahistorical hypothesis that Joyce recreates for us the birth of the city. The growth of the spoken and written word, the invention of tools, born of, quote, mappa necessity, mother of engines. It is rather as if these things were personal experiences, once forgotten and by a prodigious effort of memory brought to mind. And that's one of the really powerful things about Finnegans Wake, is that it is the most personal text you will ever read. It personifies that which is well beyond personality, makes individual that which we do not consider as a subject, and in that way, it is the maximally cosmically empathetic work that we need today. It allows us to see faces and things that we didn't think could be facialized, that we didn't think could be so pregnant with imagination and imagery and affect. I just love this passage and love that Budgeon even mentions it here because it really speaks to the ecological consciousness that we see in the Eddas, where trees and stones are replete with mythological imagery that reminds us to stay cemented in the earth, that we don't need to escape or forget about the earth, because there is a profoundly ecological view in Finnegans Wake that reminds us where we came from. Budgeon writes, further, he sees 1,000 years of human destinies crowded into the silence and fury of a snowstorm on a river. And he quotes here one of my favorite passages in the Wake, purely alliterative, onomatopoeic, and yet fantastically meaningful, which indeed depicts a snowstorm. Countlessness of live stories have never fallen by this plague. Flick as flowflakes, litters from aloft, like a vast wizard all the worlds. Now are all tuned to the moon, Iskis to Iskis, Erda from Erda, pride, O pride, thy prize. A beautifully evocative passage, which really stretches out to the reader to think about hearing voices in place you might not hear them. In many ways, Finnegans Wake reminds me, or rather evokes in me, what I would imagine living with schizophrenia might be like. In Stuart Gilbert's Prolegomena to Work in Progress, he similarly emphasizes the relationship between content and form that Beckett stressed, saying that in carefully adapting his words to his subject matter, Mr. Joyce is not performing a mere conjuring trick with the immense vocabulary he has at his command, but is going back to the original and natural methods of human speech. By extension, in such passages as that quoted above, the adaptation of words to subject was carried into the domain of style. But the principle remained the same, the fixing of the reader's mind on the subject matter by every possible means, the exploitation of every potentiality of the language to create a complete harmony between form and content. And of course, this harmony is always kind of shifting in and out on either side, moving closer and closer to more standardly evocative, formal, proper English, which is more content-laden, to the more onomatopoeic, more sensuous, purely formal notion of progression, development, and meaning and whatnot. The unusual word formation of work in progress, he says, is a constitutive metabolism of the primal matter of language, and was called for by its subject and is thereby justified, but it will in all probability remain in unique creation. Once and only once, and by one only. For it is inconceivable that such a method of writing could prevail in general or narrative literature, and it would be wrong to see in work in progress the promise of a systematic disintegration of language or any sort of propaganda for an international tongue, a new Volapük or Esperanto. Indeed, disciples of the New World would defeat their own ends. The word building of work in progress is founded on the rock of petrified language, of sounds with solid associations. And that is such an insightful statement right there. The word building of work in progress is founded on the rock of petrified language, of sounds with solid associations. And that might sound strange because you can read a lot of these words. I mean, the thunder word on the first page. Baba badal garachta kamina ron konton bronner ron chon twan trava hernon skontoho hordan turnuk. You're like, what the fuck even is that? And yes, this doesn't mean that every word is just going to have its meaning immediately written on its face. But it does mean that we need to take into account as a constitutive element of the meaning of the text the immediate effect that it brings us, the evocation that is part of language. Think about performative language, in which the very meaning of the word is the act that it perpetuates. It is a speech act in the proper sense. This would be things like commanding or ordering or prosecuting or like, I pronounce you husband and wife is a good example, right? All this does is communicate a incorporeal transformation of elements, as Deleuze and Guattari put it. It changes the face of your relationship between you and your wife in a very substantive manner. It changes the way you will be treated by your government. It changes the way you might feel towards each other because you're officially married now, and all these things. So in a similar way, we have the direct immediacy of speech acts just proliferated throughout Finnegans Wake in such a way that this petrified language, think about a petrified organism. It dries in the sun and it hardens and it calcifies, turning into a stone, which is an archive, a refuse for a past forgotten, for something which has perhaps gotten too close to the sun in a certain sense. It has tried to fly too close. It has not used its cards properly, but it remains. It leaves a trace, and that trace is here for us to find, such that language itself takes on this totemistic, archival aspect. It has bred within it a history which explodes and leaks onto the page. I really think that Finnegans Wake's words are tangible. They are sonically solid. They're tasteable between the teeth. He says, were this groundwork to be undermined by a general decomposition of words, the edifice would in time be submerged in the shifting sand of incoherence. There would be a dissolution of logical speech and thought, and in the last end, man would revert to his brutish state, as it was in the beginning before the law-father thundered. A dangerous game, in truth, the jeu de mots, this vivisection of the word made flesh. But so perhaps was creation itself, the rash invention of a progressive Olympian with a penchant for practical jokes. And this laughability in the face of the divine is evoked very well in the way that Stuart Gilbert writes here, but it also speaks to the singularity of Finnegans Wake. This does not promise to be a universal. This is why I really like Finn Fordham's book, Lots of Fun at Finnegans Wake, in which he talks about how it unravels universals, how it doesn't seek to build up absolutes, but rather to enter into critical conversation with the notion of truth, of absolutes, of nature, of experience, of appearance, of solidity, of reality. All of these words, in a properly postmodern sense, are brought into dialectical conversation, not in the Hegelian teleological sense, as if they approach some fixed end. No, they remain in infinite hermeneutical spiraling, in a progression which commands momentum. Keep in mind this statement of Gilbert's if you plan on reading Finnegans Wake and might be a bit skeptical. Maybe you've heard something about it, or you've read the first page and you're just not really feeling it. Of all the aspects of work in progress, this perhaps will prove the most disconcerting to the general reader. The boisterous joviality of certain passages, the verbal horseplay, for instance, of that past master of conceit, Jaunty John, will certainly offend those who hold that gravity should exclude buoyancy in treating of first and last things. But after all, the terms heavy and light are relative. Birth and death, the story of the fall, God's mysterious ways to man, all these are tragic or absurd, according to the observer's standpoint. Exclusive seriousness, indeed, is a colorblindness of the intellect. And that is indeed something to keep in the back of one's mind when reading Finnegans Wake. Give it the benefit of the doubt. Let it ramble on for a little bit. There are sections that I don't enjoy either, but the multitudinous majority of Finnegans Wake is positively ecstatic and funny and interesting and mind-bogglingly complex. In Robert McAlmon's Mr. Joyce Directs an Irish Word Ballet, he maintains that we should keep in mind the openness of the text because this is essential to the way that Joyce approached productivity. If you read any of his manuscripts, if you see any of his correspondences and the way that he developed these passages, you'll see that there is always a hesitancy and an attempt to go where we don't feel like we should be going. The notion of should be going somewhere, of the text should be something, is always brought into question in such a way that Joyce is so hypercritical that it's almost as if he implodes in on himself like an atom bomb. And indeed, McGammon says he admits to philological rag-picking because the great passion of his life is words, their colors and implications. He does not intend to create a new literary Esperanto, but he wishes to originate a flexible language that might be an Esperanto of the subconscious, and he wishes to believe that anybody reading his work gets a sensation of understanding, which is the understanding which music is allowed without too much explanation. Indeed, think about the openness to a piece of music. It is infinitely more difficult to put into formal terms what's going on in a piece of music versus a piece of literature. You have the imagistic immediacy and a lot more of the standards necessary in literature to get a very solid notion of intention. But the sonority of music necessarily tends towards implication, at best metaphor. It goes away from that directness of associating a clear meaning with a certain sound. It's way more relativistic, in my opinion, than written or spoken language, because totally different sounds, like a minor chord can sound totally different in their affective associations from person to person, especially from culture to culture. And as such, Joyce wishes that in response to meaning, that we permit their sensibilities to remain open and susceptible and capable of response to the implications of a literature that is not a literature of escape, of interpretation, of propaganda or reform, or of God or morality seeking. Joyce was terribly anti-dogmatic, and you can see that in his text. He just hated literary convention so much, not because he couldn't do it. You can read Ulysses and see these remarkable entire chapters of parody of the English language. For example, the 14th chapter, Oxen of the Sun, in which he develops a growing parody of the English language from its earliest translations of Latin to modern Irish, American, Welsh, Scottish slang, Italian slang, all of these other people, all brought into this one milieu, which is really one of the more Wakean moments in Ulysses that shows us what we have. It shows us the elements we have at our disposal that we can use. He goes on furthermore that his wish is to evoke literary music, a ballet of dancing words that suggest the clear line and mass form which is the beauty quality that good art has. The river may be flowing, or he may be wishing to summon up the sounds of night, or to awaken the emotions that night thought brings. Joyce's intentness is on making his characters and his effects a composite evocation of types, or of the summarization of a kind of poetry, sensation, movement, or a species of act. That indeed is the perfect explication of what characters are in Finnegans Wake. They are a species of act. They are a general, formal evocation of the way that certain acts act. It's like act squared in a really weird way. Finally, very briefly, in John Rodker's Joyce and His Dynamic, he says that here in Work in Progress, it's as though the words held in solution the elements, inarticulate in both reader and author, which we call dynamic. There is an élan vital at the very center of Finnegans Wake, a vital motion which, as Hobbes says, starts in germination and goes until death. Dust unto dust it remains, Joyce wants to say, that even in the refuse, even in the petrified things that we think are dead, they in fact contain at least the memory and the germinative potential for future life, for future creation, and thus why nothing is too obscure for Joyce. For thinking is first affective. Words make it flesh insofar as they serve to define feeling. But beneath all words lie affective contacts which might, it would seem, entirely dispense with words as signs, but not as sounds. And indeed, this is something you see in Vico when he talks about the birth of language, that it happened through these just primal grunts and squelches and screeches. You see that all the time in Finnegans Wake, where you'll have these random sonic expletives that they don't really carry any formal significance. That's not the point. They are properly evocative, dynamic, energetic. This is an extreme instance, interesting only as an example of how the mind works. But it must be obvious that an author completely aware, and by completely I mean to a degree transcending literature as we have known it, of the forces he is using and anxious to produce the most naturalistic picture possible of an individual and of the repressions, complications, forces which direct that individual before they express themselves in words, must have recourse to all the hybrid, formless, onomatopoeic, and conventional sounds in which feeling clothes itself. Because we're trying to evoke not only the sleeping, restful mind, but in the very paradoxical sense of, for example, understanding that the brain during dreaming most directly resembles the waking brain. This is the sort of sleep-waking paradox that a lot of psychologists have understood from our neurophysiology and our neuropsychology. Then, in fact, we're trying to understand the subconscious in its fullest sense, that which spills over at the stultified moment of sleep, that in fact testifies to that dynamism constantly moving through one, the churning, stultifying effects that go on in sleep. And in fact, he says that what Joyce is trying to achieve is the possibility of a complete symbiosis of reader and writer. And I'm not sure that he does that. I think that he certainly tried, and I certainly think he did a damn good job, but I don't think a complete universal synthesis is possible, and I don't think Joyce was necessarily trying to do that. But with that said, I ask you, what do you think? Maybe you should try reading Finnegans Wake and see if you agree. I hope that what I've said about this examination has been helpful, that it has given you some ideas and helped cement a critical way of looking at Finnegans Wake that might help your journey. Whether you're a newcomer or a seasoned expert, this is a great work to get your hands on. I read it in a day because it was just so captivating, which I read very slow, so that's an accomplishment for me. But that being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat helpful. You can check out any of my other stuff I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. I've also got a channel membership you can join for $5 a month, and you can gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom that I do the second Sunday of every month at 2 p.m. Central. Check the channel description to be sure, because I forget the time zone. You can also donate to the channel one time if you just like to help me out, because it helps me purchase wonderful books like this so that I can hopefully share them to you. That being said, that's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.